So, welcome everybody. This is the second Museum of Care seminar about Spinoza, and the first of a series of meetings aimed to assess more in depth the theoretical and philosophical background of David Graeber's thought. We aim at continuing the dialogue that David had with the philosophers of the past and of present days. And the first meeting, and in order to do that, we'll have some lectures on Spinoza, Bhaskar, Schalins, and dialogue with Kassem, that was one of the philosophers that David mentioned as his favorite. And the first of these lectures will be on February the 10th with Maxime Revers. Maxime is very interesting because he wrote a beautiful essay about Spinoza, but he did it in the form of a novel because he wanted to show not just the context of the development of Spinoza's thought, but really the dialogue that he had with his contemporaries. And it's very on the line of what David said, for example, in The Dawn of Everything. There is no great man. There is people that are able to put in line and to express in a concise form what was going on in taverns and bars and cafes, and what was the public debate of an epoch. And so this aspect of dialogue, of co-creation of ideas is crucial for Spinoza, for Maxime, who is the translator, the French translator of David's possibilities, and for David too. Coming to tonight's discussion, I suggested to read Spinoza's political treatise, first 5 chapters, for 2 reasons. Because I think that this work is the simplest, is useful to better understand what Spinoza says in the Ethics, looking backwards from this, that is the last of Spinoza's works. And also because this is the most political of Spinoza's works, and it's very useful, in my opinion, to better understand The Dawn of Everything's 10th chapter, the one about why the state has no origins. The idea of common strength that is that is opposed to that of authorities that we can find in political treatise is the same of the 10th chapter of The Dawn of Everything. And moreover, the idea that a multitude can self-organize and is at the most of its power when it self-organizes without an opposition between those in power and those on the bottom, is the very idea of this chapter. As I already mentioned, this is the work when Spinoza dives the most on the concept of multitude that has been taken by Tony Negri to develop his idea of a constituent power and of a power of the of constituent power. This is the very same idea, but in my opinion, Tony, as a philosopher, takes this concept and uses it in a slightly different way from that of Spinoza, that is more about a sort of physics of power, of capabilities. When, as you may have noticed in these chapters, when Spinoza says power, it's never dominion, it's never authority, it's always capability, it's always ability to do. The concept of power that he expresses in this work is what in the ethics is a cupiditas or conatus, the individual expression of the ability to be a cause, that is the very nature of each individual being as an expression of the infinite creative power of God. As you may remember, in our first reading group, I said that in my opinion, David had never read Spinoza. I stand corrected, both by the tweet that Vasily shared, where David puts Spinoza together with Bashkar at the top of the list of his favorite philosophers, and more important, by a short note he made in a webinar at Beaver 16 with Nika, when he said, this reminds me that power, this reminds me of Spinoza. He said, power is both the power to act, but also the power to be acted on, or to affect and to be affected at the same time. This short note is important because it requires a deep knowledge of Spinoza. At first glance, what Spinoza says is quite the contrary. Power is to affect, is to be a cause, and impotence is to be affected, to be subject to external causes. It's only when one goes more in depth and examines the idea of convenire, that is can be translated as to agree, and is actually translated in the English version of the ethics as agreement, as to agree or agreement, and also in political treatise it's translated agreement, agreeing or agreement. So when one looks more in depth on this idea and to the fourth part of ethics, it becomes clear that the relationship with external things can very well be one of mutual empowerment, and that this mutual empowerment is key to the relationships between among human beings. So to better understand this concept, we need to go back to the ethics, to look back to the ethics, and we're starting from the 18th proposition of the fourth part, the value. I've written down notes, so you don't need. I'll share the notes. Sorry. In this 18, this column of the notes about the 18 proposition of the fourth part of ethics, Spinoza says, Spinoza overturns the idea of being free is being a cause on one's own. The value of our relationship with external things becomes a value of cooperation. It's not just that he says we can never arrive at doing without all external things for the preservation of our being or living. So that it's not just that we cannot help but having relationships with other things that are outside ourselves. It's also that, I quote, if we consider our mind, we see that our intellect would be more imperfect if mind were alone and could understand nothing besides itself. There are then, says Spinoza, many things outside ourselves which are useful to us and are therefore to be desired. Of such, none can be discerned more excellent than those which are in entire agreement with our nature. For if, for example, two individuals of entirely the same nature are united, they form a combination twice as powerful as either of them singly. The last sentence, as you may have noticed, is the same that you have met in the political treatise. Literally, if two come together and unite their strength, they have jointly more power and consequently more right over nature than both of them separately. And far more, and the more there are that have so joined in alliance, the more right they all collectively will possess. It's about a union of forces. In the political treatise, it's quite mechanical. It's just in the political treatise, it's about proving that it's about discussing how this union of individual strengths works, how it happens that a multitude can act as if it was guided by one mind, how it happens that we can cooperate, and how do the forces at play in this cooperation interact and work, what happens when there is a division in these forces, and division is always when there is an authority. That's why Spinoza says the only absolute empire, imperium absolutum, I think in the English translation is dominium absolutum. It's a very bad word to translate this concept, but this concept is very difficult to translate. The word imperium, as Spinoza uses it in political treatise, is very peculiar, and so it is actually difficult to translate. The word imperium is what Machiavelli would call state. And I was a bit bewildered when reading The Dawn of Everything 10th chapter, because actually the fact that the state has no origin is a matter of fact for me. The very concept of state as we now think of it is born in modern age. Graeber and Wengrow say it's Jean Baudin. Actually, it's Machiavelli. In the first lines of The Prince are all states in history have been either monarchies, either principati, or republics. And by he uses this word to mean just status in Latin, and in Italian means condition, state of facts. And Machiavelli uses this term to in order to have the more neutral term. He doesn't want to speak of forms of government, of monarchies or aristocracies or republics. He wants to say any kind of union of forces, human union of forces, as to be in the form of a republic or or a principatus, monarchy. This is the very way Spinoza uses the term imperium. And so doing, he changes the meaning of the word, because imperium meant command, authority, meant power in the sense of domination, while Spinoza, in Spinoza, imperium is just the state of the civil state, and the union of forces is the ability to join forces. We constitute an imperium when we join forces. And that's why he can say the only absolutum imperium is that of the power of all, of everybody, the democracy. Because to be absolute for a power, for a common power, yes, imperium means common power. To be absolute doesn't mean to be solved, to be freed from a transcendent power, from a transcendent law. The idea of a transcendent law, the idea of God as a legislator, as a ruler that gives laws that can be disobeyed is just superstition. The only natural law is the human capability, the fact that things tends to create and produce and reproduce themselves together. And the only place for law and for right is the civil law, is the rules that we agree together Therefore, the only power that is total, that is that has no limits, is the one that has no internal limits. That is the power of a multitude that is not fragmented in relationships of dominion that empowers the common power of the multitude. So going back to the notion of power and of conatus, and going back to the idea of convenire, power is the ability to be a cause, and misery is not the fact that we belong to the natural order of nature, and therefore we are in need and we can't be alone in producing our effects. But misery would be the absence of need, to be alone and to not conceive anything outside ourselves. What is good for human beings is what is good for us as human beings lies precisely in the possibility to increase the multiplicity of things on which our bodies and minds are mutually nourished and changed. It is from this multiplicity, from the ability to create together, from the plurality of forces that we join and that create together, that comes the power of human mind. In proposition 14 of the second part of the Ethics, Spinoza says the human mind is capable of perceiving a great number of things, and so in proportion as its body is capable of receiving a great number of impressions. Deleuze made a big deal of it, saying, stressing the place where Spinoza says, we don't know of what a body is capable. A body is a multiplicity of things, and the more this multiplicity increases, and the more we join forces and so increase this multiplicity, the more the mind is powerful. Again, Spinoza, he who possesses a body capable of the greatest number of activities possesses a mind whereof the greatest part is eternal. The reason, the coincidence with God, the knowledge, the very knowledge of God, is lies in the increase of the capabilities of our body and mind. The reason why I thought that David never read sorry, Spinoza is that these concepts resonate so much with what he said, and he never mentioned Spinoza when discussing such ideas. Think, for example, of bullshit jobs. When he speaks of the pleasure of being a cause and the misery of not being a cause, when he says that the very violence of prison is to isolate people and prevent them from being causes together with others, he's stating the same thing that Spinoza says in Ethics and here in a political treatise. But he doesn't even mention Spinoza. He says we are miserable when we feel we are not a cause, because much of our sense of being a self, a being discrete from its surrounding environment, comes from the joyful realization that we can have predictable effects on that environment. This is true for infants and remains true throughout life. To take away this joy entirely is to squash a human like a bug. The foundational pleasure at being a cause is unstated ground of our being, and the fundamental violence of prisons consists in putting humans in isolation and stripping them of the pleasure at being a cause together. So as I already mentioned, this is the very same thing as Spinoza says, and yet David doesn't mention him. I think now that, and instead he mentions Karl Gross, a German psychologist of the beginning of the 20th century. I think this not mentioning Spinoza tells us more than about his knowledge of this philosopher, about David's method and style, even style. He never makes an argument of authority. It never says this is true because this great philosopher said so, because Spinoza said so, or because Marcel Mauss said so. He always relies on as much as possible on empirical evidence, on psychological evidence in this case, or on archaeological, as in the dawn of everything. And this avoiding authority and relying on experience is really a style, a method, but on this, at the same time, makes it more difficult at times to understand where is he aiming to. This is particularly true for me in this chapter about the state that we still haven't discussed, because, as I said before, it's I really cannot see the point in proving that the state has no origins, and that when and that the Egyptians had not a state as we now conceive it. But what's very important in this chapter, just as in the chapter we are currently reading about the original cities, is to the fact that we better understand how a multitude can constitute its power in a perpetual renegotiation and rearrangement of powers, of individual powers, without, and much better off without an authority, a prince, or a monarchy, or even an aristocracy. Something, just to conclude, something Spinoza says in the chapters you didn't read in this occasion, is that at the end of the day, all states tend to aristocracy. He says, and it's interesting concerning refugees and migrants. Venice used to be a democracy, but the exclusion of newcomers that is related to the power that the first citizens had on the newcomers made of it an aristocracy. And on the other side, it doesn't exist a real monarchy, because the power of one individual can never be at level with the power of a multitude. This physics of powers is the core method of the political treatise, and is the better answer, the better response to Hobbes' solution. What Spinoza made face to Hobbes and the idea that you can get peace by transferring the power to one individual is quite mocking it. Spinoza says, oh, it's wonderful in theory. You can unite forces by having a monarch. But in reality, it doesn't work, because we are all equal of power, and we know it, and we don't want to obey. So the reality of facts is that we comply with decisions only when we want to, when we have a good reason to. And this reason can be fear, or the imposition of power, or even the hope for a good, for a reward. But it doesn't last. The only way to have a power that is really absolute, that really works, is convenire, is consensus, is the union of forces through agreement. So I think this can be enough as an introduction. I give you the floor if you have comments or questions or connections to make. Oh.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. I don't have much experience with Spinoza, but it was interesting. I just started reading the Dawn of Humanity. I can't remember what it's called, the Graeber book, and it was interesting what you were saying about Graeber never appealing to authority, because it seems like that's sort of what Spinoza does right off the bat. So he says, like, I am fully convinced that experience has revealed every conceivable form of commonwealth. And I took that to be like he's relying on written recordings of different, like from, Machiavelli or Tacitus or whoever. And so once he has those written recordings, he can just go make a massive theoretical system, which people have to abide by roughly. And I guess I don't know where I'm going with this, but yeah, I guess the difference is like there's sort of a naivety that reason will allow us to think ourselves into these sort of ideal states, which is maybe not the case anymore. And I wonder if that's because Spinoza sort of his own time, where reason is you can sort of create these states by reasoning through them instead of figuring out through experience what works and what doesn't. I don't know if that makes sense. It was kind of a jumble.
Well, he rather than relying on experience, Spinoza is opposing the transcendental idea of a human being with the experience. It's rather an appeal to materiality, and he's totally relying on Machiavelli and on discourses on Tito Livio and on the humanistic tradition. Spinoza can be considered a reaction of the humanistic tradition to the Puritanism and to the naissance of the modern kind of authority. It's also interesting that even if he uses very much mathematical insights, he writes an ethics more demonstrated through the geometrical order. He makes a lot of use of logics and of mathematics even. And as I said, the political treatise is a sort of physics of power, of human capabilities. So it's when he says experience has shown everything, he's not quite saying I will discuss these experiences, and he's just saying what I'm stating is coherent with experience, while the idea that there is a law that we should abide, but we can disobey, and that human nature is something different from what we experience every day, is what I am against. It's a superstition. I don't know if I was so clear. So Spinoza claims on experience against the transcendental idea of a human being, but he doesn't rely so much on experience. On the contrary, David relies a lot on experience. The difference is also that at Spinoza's time, just as at Rousseau's time, we had not so much of a wealth of experiences and of recorded experiences as we have now. There were tales from Herodotus about barbarians, something by Tacitus, but there was no anthropological research, there was no collection of evidences. There were just tales of voyagers, like the Jesuits that David's quote in his book, in their book. but not much more. Speaking of the voyagers, there is an interesting letter in Spinoza's Epistolarium about, it's a letter, a very important letter about imagination. And actually he tells us about a nightmare he had. And this nightmare is about a Brazilian. And there is a whole history behind this nightmare that is at the time the Dutch were in power in Brazil, and they were at war with the Portuguese that at the end of the day won and got Brazil for themselves. And Portuguese made this war using the rebellions of slaves against Dutch. And so this nightmare tells us about rebellion against slavery that produced other slavery historically. And this is a very interesting episode, but I didn't dive on it too enough. Just a small note. Michael?
Yeah, just on that concept of experience, of relying on experience, it is funny that in David Graeber's book, Dawn of Everything, one of the arguments is that the modern idea that somehow primitive people were primitive and they didn't have experience of all these different worlds, that's the fundamental thing. They're saying actually they were quite sophisticated and they'd had experience of lots of types of political situations. And their first example is a group of people that have one political system in the one part of the year when they're in small groups, and another political system when they're in another part of the year. But that's more the way that we use the word experience. I wanted to ask, I think Hume, I'm sorry to be foolish on philosophy, but I think Hume is a bit after this, and he's the one that sort of focuses on empirical. And the English, the Scottish Enlightenment and the English tradition has so much focus on empiricism that you have to look to see what is there to prove. And is this not, maybe the word experience is an early claim to say we should be empirical, that our systems shouldn't be just systems that are made, they should be made from our experience in the world, that they have like a claim towards empiricism. I don't know if that's true. And I also, so then, which sounds funny because Spinoza is really hard to read because he does do this logical system, right? Which is the way, and the type of, and I don't know much about this. Maybe Simona would want to comment, but is Spinoza not in some way a reaction to Descartes? So Descartes is the sort of first person who moves away from the scholastics and moves into this new type of philosophy, which talks about rationality, talks about subjects and objects. And the kind of chief way is and why scientists all love the Descartes, or they say, because Descartes says there is a subject and that subject acts on objects in the world. And it sort of separates them out. Whereas the scholastics sort of had a sense of a concept of form, which is very useful in art, right? The form of something. And if you see something, like you see a tree, you see the form, you participate in that tree because you take it into your eye. You're part of it. So you're always connected to the world, whereas Descartes broke people down with the world. Spinoza and built this big system that could be applied for science and for rationality, but Spinoza also different than Descartes. Descartes says there's all these different substances. So the beginnings of a modern science, like we now have elements of, this is this type of substance and that type of substance. But Spinoza, which is the one thing that I've sort of picked up, is as one substance in the world, and that's a sort of the divine substance, that everything is together, which is why his philosophy is never transcendental. It's always immanent, because you're always the same substance with everybody else, with God. And that substance is sort of the whole world is divine, like a type of animism. If you were speaking about Brazil, the Amazonian tribes are famous for having an animistic framework where everything is alive. And so I just wondered if some of this system building and experience and sort of being immanent rather than transcendental, even though Spinoza writes in this really awkward, what we would see as system building type of way, with like logic about rules about how people work and all this, is that not, how does that relate to the way philosophy is written at the time and his reaction, if you think he is a reaction to Descartes?
Well, concerning Descartes, sorry, Spinoza moves definitely in the Descartes frame. And he takes it to the extreme consequences. At the same time, he goes against the very core of Cartesianism, that is the separation between matter and soul and spirit. When Spinoza says there's only one substance, and when you divide body and spirit, there is no way to put them together again. He's contesting Descartes, and he's connecting with the tradition of materialism. In a letter, Spinoza says, I don't make nothing, just like in David's Twitter, I don't make nothing of Plato or Aristoteles. My source is rather Democritus and Lucretius. So he declares himself a materialist, but his idea of materiality is that of something alive. What Descartes did was to divide the natural world from the human world, because at the end of the day, it's the human being as a rational subject that has a soul that belongs to the world of the spirit, while the natural world and even animals and plants, the nature is all on the side of the res extensa, of the material things. And so in Descartes, you have a human soul that is in direct connection with God, and that knows because God guarantees his knowledge, and a material world totally separated. Spinoza treats the natural and material world as a living thing that produces, he focuses on effects, on he even destroys the traditional concept of substance as what stays, what lies behind the ever changeable nature of things. Well, Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, had a problem with change. Their idea was if something is true today and isn't true anymore tomorrow, this isn't really true. It's only partially true. What is really, what is real for real, what is really true, is what lies behind the change, what doesn't change, that is substance. Spinoza says, no, the only thing that never changes is that everything changes, is the infinite production of effects. God, the only substance, is what causes itself, is causa sui. The very essence of the world is this infinite production of effects. And so it's the very reality of world is change, is creation. Coming to the issue of experience and of empiricism, actually, there is no such a thing as experience without theory. The only difference is while you can have a theory without experience or without declared or without an experience you are aware of. I mean, when Rousseau made his thought experiment about the origins of inequality, he was tapping on his experience of civilization equals hierarchy, but he was not consciously tapping on it, and he was declaring, I'm making a thought experiment because we don't know what happened. Nevertheless, and David says something about theory and experience in some interesting pages. You always make theory, and you always cut some part of your experience outside the frame, because if you don't, you cannot make sense of what you are experiencing. So when empiricists claimed to be empirical, they were just claiming a different way of making theory. What David always makes is to suggest. He says this series of experiences we have suggest that it can be interpreted this way or this other way. He always declares what he's doing, and he often relies on common sense in the sense of what people experiencing bullshit jobs think of their experience. Bullshit jobs is very interesting on the side of method, because he's so David in this work is so strictly relying on what people think about their experience. The only thing you can make as a theory is what people say about the theory people make about their experience. But there is always a theory. There is always an interpretation. The interpretation, sorry, the interpretive labor is the very essence of our mental life. Or at least this is my opinion. Maybe I'm mistaken. This is my suggestion for an interpretation. Nika?
Yeah, I just wanted to be mindful of time because we're over an hour. And also I want to suggest that maybe if everything will go well with this philosophy lectures, we can expand it not only to philosophers that David possibly was liking, but the one that he didn't, like Descartes, for example, you know, so that will be fun to do. And maybe we can pick up some people who collectively who wrote about them and invite them to have a seminar or open lectures. And also I want us to
A philosophy fight club, Lucretius and Democritus versus Plato, and you know, or Descartes versus Spinoza. I'm sure that might actually pull in a very different crowd.
yeah, yes, Simona, you wanted to write something for the Fight Club. I think that's exactly one that you must write, and then we find some actors to play it. And I also want to make some small remark. So if I understood correctly what you said, Simona, you said that you quote Spinoza, who was saying that any monarchy will eventually become an aristocracy, but you also describe how the treatment of refugees in Venice destroy the democracy and make it aristocracy. So I just want to mention that David was always saying that we are not living in, of course, we're not living in democracy, but we do live in aristocracy, because this all this machine of choosing the best leaders is like, you know, like aristocracy mean the rule of the best, literally. So like we even don't pretend. So, but it will be interesting, maybe future for me, for example, to if you would have time and interest, maybe we can have more as a seminar about political implication right now for what Spinoza was saying in this text, because this text is, for me, was very difficult to read and very complex and long. And if we can spend another hour in the future, maybe after the end of these lectures that we plan now, to kind of summarize more and be talking more about where David was connected to Spinoza, but also about details of what Spinoza proposed, maybe, or what he understood was going on.
Yeah, as for Hobbes, I'm not sure I'm able to, but what would be fun would be to show how Spinoza made fun of Hobbes. He always says, "Oh yes, this works very well in theory, but unfortunately, it doesn't work in reality." And is instead what David said about we are living in an aristocracy was more as far as I can get from The Dawn of Everything, about and also from other texts about democracy, was about elections. Elections are an aristocracy, are to select the best, and this entails power. With there is no way it doesn't entail aristocracy, while Spinoza, well, the political treatise is incomplete. Spinoza didn't manage to write the most interesting chapter about democracy, and what is left is 2 pages that are horrible, so horrible that I hope they weren't written by Spinoza. And instead, he says about monarchy that since a single man cannot be at level with a multitude, he always needs to be surrounded by a court, by people helping him, and therefore simply it doesn't exist something like a monarchy. And this criticism of monarchy is interesting because the solution of the legislator, of the one man at command that with his own single rationality is able to order everything, was the wet dream of Machiavelli and his most important contradiction. Machiavelli was a Republican. He was for freedom, and he studied Tito Livius' discourses and wrote discourses on his Prima Decade to prove that it's conflict that kept free the town of Rome free, and that to explain how a republic, a commonwealth in English terms, does work. But he couldn't solve the problem of how the good orders that must make a community work can be written. He said in his idea, only a prince, only a single man authority could, only a legislator could write such orders. And that's why he wrote The Prince. That's why he wanted Valentino to rule over Italy. Spinoza, but Spinoza notes there's a contradiction in this. A legislator like Moses will always write laws that sustain his power, and there's no way a monarch will write laws that sustain a republic, a commonwealth, a common power of people. The problem is how it can be that a multitude writes its own rules. Spinoza doesn't tell us how. David and David do in The Dawn of Everything, and they do by relying on experience. They prove that it happened and how it happened. But I made a big spoiler of chapter 10. But I think it's also chapter 8, so I'm innocent because we are already reading it. So, shall we wrap up? So, hope to see all of you on the 10th of February with Maxime Robert. It will be, I'm sure it will be amazing. And I don't know if we have a, a reading group on the on the Dawn of Everything on the 20th of January. And I think that's all for our next meetings. Is it, Nika?
I think we also have Vasily, I don't remember what date is a public lecture about pirates. If this is like
yeah, it's going to be on the 7th of February. We're going to have Marcus Rediker, who's going to come and talk about pirates. Marcus Rediker is one of the main historians on the subject, so we are really happy to have him. So again, 7th of February, and it's going to be it's not going to be on a Thursday, it's not going to be at 8 o'clock London time, it's going to be on a Monday at 6 o'clock London time. So sorry about this all these changes that might be a bit confusing for you all. More info on the website.
Okay, so goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Simona, again.
Thank you for listening.